4.8 million. That is the amount Speaker Mike Johnson authorized in taxpayer funds to defend members of Congress accused of ethics violations in the 18 months since he took the gavel, not to defend the institution, not to defend the Constitution, to defend individual members from accountability for their own documented misconduct. 47 separate cases. 47 times the American people paid lawyers to argue that elected officials should face no consequences for behavior that would get any private citizen fired or prosecuted. Jasmine Crockett had been waiting 9 months for the opportunity to ask the speaker one very simple question about that number. By the time the C-SPAN broadcast ended, he would be unable to answer it, and his silence would confirm everything Americans already suspected about who their government actually serves. The House Oversight Committee hearing room on the morning of March 14th held the particular acoustics of institutional power about to be redistributed. Speaker Johnson entered at 9:58 a.m. through the private entrance that speakers used to avoid the press gauntlet in the main corridor, and he carried himself with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent 20 years in elected office without ever facing a genuinely hostile question. His background was constitutional law, specifically religious liberty cases, and he had built a career on the principle that moral authority derived from adherence to biblical principle, and that government's highest purpose was to protect the faithful from secular persecution. He wore a Navy suit that photographs described as unremarkable, and a flag pin that every speaker has worn since September 12, 2001. And he took his seat at the witness table with the posture of someone who believed that his presence at this hearing was a courtesy. He was extending rather than and merely obligation he was fulfilling. Congresswoman Crockett sat three seats down from the chairman, positioned so that Johnson would have to turn his body fully to face her when she began her questioning. She had arrived at 9:15 a.m., 43 minutes before the hearing's scheduled start, and she had spent that time arranging materials on the desk in front of her in a sequence that she had practiced the previous evening until the physical motions became automatic. 3 ring binders, each one 3 inches thick, each one tabbed with colored markers that were visible from the press gallery. A laptop open to a spreadsheet with 47 rows of data. A single printed photograph in a clear plastic sleeve face down on the desk that she did not touch and did not reference, but that remained in Johnson's eye line throughout the hearing's first 90 minutes, like a landmine whose presence everyone could sense but no one could identify. The chairman gavelled the hearing to order at 10:04 a.m. and delivered the standard opening statement about the committee's solemn responsibility to provide oversight and accountability. Johnson delivered his own opening statement without notes, speaking for 11 minutes about the sanctity of the legislative branch and the importance of protecting members' ability to do their jobs without frivolous accusations or politically motivated investigations. His voice carried, the practice cadence of a Sunday school teacher explaining difficult scripture to teenagers who would rather be anywhere else. He used the word sacred 4 times. He used the word accountability 0 times. He concluded by expressing his hope that this hearing would be conducted with the seriousness and respect that the office of Speaker deserved, and he folded his hands on the table in front of him and waited with the calm of someone who had already decided that, whatever questions came next could be deflected with procedural language and constitutional principles that sounded, profound enough to, fill the space where answers should go. The first round of questioning came from the committee chairman and focused on scheduling procedures and legislative priorities. Johnson answered each question with the smooth competence of someone discussing matters he had discussed in 40 previous hearings, and nothing in his demeanor suggested that he understood this hearing would be different from any of those previous 40. The second round came from the ranking member and focused on the speaker's relationship with the former president and whether he had acted appropriately in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Johnson deployed the same defense he had used in every previous forum. He was a constitutional lawyer. He had questions about election procedures in several states. Those questions were legitimate, and asking them was his duty, regardless of how the media chose to characterize it. The answers were practiced enough that he delivered them while making notes on a legal pad in front of him, half his attention on the questions being asked and half on whatever internal monologue he was documenting for later use. Crockett's turn came at 11:43 a.m., 2 hours and 39 minutes into a hearing that C-SPAN's live viewer count showed had lost 40% of its initial audience. She did not begin with a question. She began with a number, 47. Her voice was quieter than the previous questioners, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood that in a room full of people competing for volume, quietness was the most effective way to make people lean forward and listen. That is the number of separate ethics cases where your office has authorized taxpayer funds to provide legal defense for members of Congress accused of misconduct, not impeachment proceedings, not constitutional challenges, individual ethics cases involving individual members' personal conduct. I want to be very precise about this because the number matters. 47 cases, $4. $8 million in legal fees, all of it paid by the American people to defend members from accountability for their own actions. Johnson's hand stopped moving on the legal pad. He looked up with the expression of someone who had, just heard a question in a language they thought they understood, but that suddenly seemed to contain unfamiliar grammar. Congresswoman, I'm not sure where you're getting those numbers, but the Speaker's office has a long-standing practice of providing legal support when members face frivolous or politically motivated accusations that could interfere with their constitutional duties. That's not controversial. That's been the practice under speakers of both parties for decades. Crockett opened the first binder. Red tabs. She did not remove any pages. She simply opened it so that the index sections were visible and the volume of material was apparent. I'm getting those numbers from the House Office of General Counsel, which is required to report all legal expenditures over $50,000 to the Committee on House Administration. I have every invoice, every case number, every member's name, every law firm, every billable hour. I also have the identical reports from the previous 3 speakers going back 12 years. Would you like to know how much Speaker Pelosi spent on individual members' ethics defense during her 4 years? Take a guess. Johnson shifted in his chair, movement small enough that most viewers would not consciously register it, but large enough that the C-SPAN camera operator zoomed in incrementally. I'm not going to play guessing games about numbers taken out of context. If you have a specific question about a specific case, I'm happy to address it. But comparing expenditures across different periods without accounting for the nature of the cases or the political environment is not a serious form of oversight. Quincy and Crockett placed her hand flat on the first page of the open binder. 0. Speaker Pelosi spent $0 of taxpayer money defending members from ethics violations. 0. Speaker Boehner spent $180,000 across 4 years on 2 cases, both involving members accused of criminal conduct that could have resulted in prison time. Speaker Ryan spent $340,000 across 2 years on 3 cases. You spent $4. $8 million in 18 months on 47 cases, 31 of which involve allegations of financial misconduct, 8 of which involve sexual harassment accusations, and 6 of which involve members who are currently under criminal investigation by the Department of Justice. Those aren't my numbers. Those are your office's numbers. I'm just reading them out loud. The silence that followed, had a different quality than, in the earlier moments of pause between questions and answers. This was not a speaker considering how to phrase a response. This was a speaker realizing that someone had done homework he had assumed no one would do, had compiled records he had assumed no one would request, and was now holding those records in a committee hearing where every word was being transcribed for the permanent record. His jaw tightened. His right hand moved from the legal pad to the edge of the table and gripped it with enough pressure that his knuckles lightened. When he spoke, his voice carried the first hint of defensive edge. Those numbers, if they're even accurate, represent the reality that members of the Republican conference have faced an unprecedented wave of politically motivated investigations designed to interfere with the people's agenda. We have a responsibility to ensure that members can do their jobs without being paralyzed by baseless accusations. Crockett opened the second binder, blue tabs. She removed a single sheet and placed it on the desk facing the camera rather than facing Johnson, a small gesture that communicated she was speaking past him to the audience watching at home. This is a letter dated August 3rd, 2024 from the Office of Congressional Ethics recommending that the House Ethics Committee investigate Representative Matt Gaetz for alleged violations of House rules regarding sexual misconduct and illicit drug use. The investigation was referred to your office for a decision on whether to provide legal support. You authorized $340,000 in taxpayer funds for his defense. 3 weeks later, the Department of Justice opened, a criminal investigation into the same conduct. You continued funding his legal defense with public money even after the criminal referral. I have the invoices. Is your position that the American people should pay for a sitting member's criminal defense attorney? Johnson's face had progressed through the early stages of the breakdown ladder. The confidence had cracked. The prepared talking points were no longer sufficient. He deployed defense mechanism number 2, attack the questioner's motives. With all respect, Congresswoman, you're cherry picking one case out of context to make a political point. You're not interested in oversight. You're interested in headlines. And I'm not going to sit here and discuss individual members' confidential legal matters in a public forum to satisfy your partisan agenda. Crockett leaned back in her chair, a posture of complete ease that contrasted deliberately with Johnson's increasingly rigid body language. You're right that I'm interested in headlines. I'm interested in the headline that says the Speaker of the House spent $8 million in taxpayer money to protect members from accountability while telling the American people that we don't have funds for veterans' health care or childhood cancer research. But you're wrong that I'm cherry picking. I have all 47 cases right here. Would you like me to read them? We have time. I have 17 minutes left in my questioning period. We could go through them alphabetically or we could go through them by dollar amount. Your choice. The room had gone completely still in the way that, in hearing rooms do when inmates and everyone present understands they are watching something consequential happen in real time. The press gallery had filled during Crockett's questioning, reporters arriving mid-hearing after receiving text alerts that something was happening in oversight. Johnson looked toward the chairman seeking an intervention that did not come. The chairman was reading the same binder tabs that Crockett had opened, doing the math on how much political damage would result from cutting off this line of questioning versus how much would result from letting it continue. Johnson found his footing with defense mechanism number 3, claim institutional prerogative. The Speaker's office has broad discretion in how it allocates resources for legal support. That discretion exists to protect the institution from politically motivated attacks that could undermine the separation of powers. I'm not going to apologize for defending the constitutional prerogatives of this House against an executive branch that has weaponized federal law enforcement for partisan purposes. Crockett opened the third binder. Yellow tabs. The motion was unhurried. She removed not one document, but a stack of perhaps 30 pages held together with a binder clip. These are the actual ethics complaints that triggered the 47 cases we're discussing. I'm going to read you just 3 of them, and then I'm going to ask you a very simple question. Case 17, Representative Redacted received $280,000 in campaign contributions from a defense contractor and then inserted a $50 million earmark for that same contractor into an appropriations bill without disclosing the relationship. Case 23, Representative Redacted employed his wife as a campaign consultant and paid her $400,000 over 2 years for work that campaign finance experts say she did not perform. Case 34, Representative Redacted used his congressional office to pressure a federal agency to grant a permit to a real estate developer who was simultaneously providing him with below market rent on a vacation property. Those aren't partisan accusations. Those are documented financial relationships that violate House ethics rules, and in 2 of those 3 cases violate federal law. You spent $680,000 in taxpayer money defending those 3 members. My question is very simple. Do you believe those are frivolous cases? The second silence lasted longer than the first. 8 seconds. 12. 15. Johnson's hands were now flat on the table in front of him, pressing down as though the table might begin to move if he did not hold it in place. His breathing had become audible in the sudden absence of speech. The tell was not just the silence, but what his face did during it, a sequence of micro expressions that read like watching someone run through a decision tree in real time, rejecting each possible answer as it arrived because every branch led to the same unacceptable conclusion. Saying yes meant admitting the cases were legitimate and that defending them was indefensible. Saying no meant claiming that documented financial corruption was frivolous and giving Crockett an opening to spend the next 10 minutes destroying that claim with evidence. There was no third option. When he finally spoke, it was not an answer to the question. It was a retreat to process. I'm not going to litigate individual cases in a public hearing. If you have concerns about specific expenditures, you can submit them through the appropriate channels and they'll be reviewed according to House rules. Crockett placed both hands on the desk in front of her and leaned forward 6 inches. Her voice remained exactly as calm as it had been from the first word, but something in the precision of her diction made it clear that the trap was now closing. Mr. Speaker, I didn't ask you to litigate anything. I asked if you believe those 3 cases are frivolous. You authorized the spending. You signed the checks. You told the American people that these legal defenses were necessary to protect the institution. I'm asking if financial corruption is frivolous or if it's serious misconduct that members should be held accountable for. That's a yes or no question. Is documented financial corruption a frivolous accusation? 23 seconds of absolute silence follow. The C-SPAN timestamp would later show that from the moment Crockett finished asking the question to the moment Johnson attempted his first response, 23 seconds elapsed without a single word being spoken. During that silence, the following things happened. A reporter in the press gallery dropped a pen, and the sound carried through the hearing room like a gunshot. The committee chairman and Senzin shifted in his chair, and the leather creaked. Someone in the back of the room coughed twice and then stopped abruptly as though they had been elbowed. Johnson's face cycled through 3 distinct shades of red, each darker than the last. His right hand lifted from the table and touched his tie, adjusting it even though it was not crooked, a gesture he made unconsciously when cornered, something his staff had tried unsuccessfully to train out of him because it broadcast vulnerability. His mouth opened. No words came. His mouth closed. He looked down at his legal pad as though the answer might be written there in notes he had somehow forgotten. The answer, when it finally came, was not an answer at all. I think we need to be very careful about making blanket judgments without understanding the full context of each individual situation and the legal standards that apply to congressional ethics versus criminal conduct and the difference between allegations and proven violations. Crockett did not let him finish. That's not what I asked. I asked if financial corruption is frivolous. The American people watching at home right now deserve a yes or no. Is a member of Congress taking money from a contractor and then giving that contractor a $50 million earmark without disclosure a frivolous accusation, or is it corruption? Johnson stood up, not in anger, not dramatically. He simply stood the way someone stands when a meeting has run too long and they have decided unilaterally that it is over. He did not storm out. He did not rip off his microphone. He reached down and gathered, his legal pad and his pen with the careful movements of someone trying to maintain dignity while executing a retreat. Mr. Chairman, I came here in good faith to answer questions about the Speaker's office operations. I did not come here to be subjected to a politically motivated show trial designed to generate clips for social media. I'm happy to continue this conversation through appropriate channels, but I'm not going to sit here and play games with someone who has already decided what they want the answer to be, regardless of what the facts show. He walked toward the private exit at 12:17 p.m., leaving his chair empty and the microphone still live on the witness table. The chairman called for a 15-minute recess. Crockett did not move. She sat with her hands folded on the 3 closed binders and watched the empty chair where the Speaker had been sitting 8 seconds earlier. The photograph in the clear plastic sleeve remained face down on her desk. She had never needed to turn it over. The preparation had been sufficient. The question had been simple enough. The silence had said everything. The photograph showed a contractor named Robert Mitchell who died of a heart attack in 2023 while waiting for payment on work his small company had completed for the federal government 18 months earlier. The work had been part of an infrastructure project authorized by a member who was one of the 47 cases Johnson's office had funded. Mitchell's widow had written to the ethics committee describing how the delays in payment had cost them their health insurance and how her husband had skipped his heart medication for 6 weeks to save money for their granddaughter's school tuition. The member in question had been accused of accepting $180,000 from a competing contractor who wanted the original contract canceled. Johnson's office had spent $290,000 defending that member from accountability. The widow's letter was in the third binder, tab 17, and Crockett had planned to read it if Johnson had attempted to answer the yes or no question about whether corruption was frivolous. He had not answered. The letter remained unread. Sometimes the silence is more powerful than the evidence you carried into the room. By 3 p.m., the 23-second silence had been clipped and posted across every platform. By midnight, it had 16 million views. The clip required no context. A simple question had been asked: is financial corruption frivolous? No answer had come. The speaker had walked out rather than say yes or no. The empty chair told the story better than any speech could have told it. This person had the option to defend the expenditures with principle or precedent or institutional necessity, and he chose instead to leave. That is confession filmed in real time. What happened in that hearing room was not a partisan confrontation about ideology. It was something older and simpler. Someone walked in believing that, like, constitutional language and moral authority and 18 months of unchallenged spending would be sufficient to survive 30 minutes of questioning. Someone else walked in with 3 binders and documentation of every dollar and a simple understanding that if you follow the money and count the cases and ask questions specific enough that the only 2 answers are truth or flight, eventually you will discover which one matters more to the person you are questioning. Johnson chose flight. In doing so, he confirmed that $4, $8 million in taxpayer money had been spent defending the indefensible, and that he knew it was indefensible, and that he would rather walk away from cameras than admit what the receipts proved. Crockett closed the binders at 12:19 p.m. and stacked them precisely, edges aligned. The entire exchange had lasted 11 minutes and 40 seconds. One question had been asked in 5 different ways. 0 answers had been given. 1 chair sat empty. By evening, Mike Johnson's decision to authorize $4, $8 million for ethics defense would be the lead story on 7 major networks. The silence would become the defining moment of his speakership more than any legislation he passed or any speech he gave. That is what happens when someone mistakes institutional authority for immunity and discovers in a public hearing that documentation matters more than office. You said at the start of this hearing that you came in good faith to answer questions. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm not the one who walked out rather than answer whether financial corruption is frivolous. I'm not the one who spent $4, $8 million in public money defending members from accountability while cutting funding for veterans and children. I'm not the one who stood at the speaker's podium for 18 months telling the American people we can't afford health care, but somehow found plenty of money to pay lawyers for members accused of taking bribes. That's not partisan politics. That's just arithmetic. And the invoices don't lie even when the people who signed them choose to walk away rather than explain them.